What you find is a writer is watching their character as if they're in a movie, and then writing what they see. So what you get on the page is Joe walked to the cabinet. He opened the door. He grabbed his coffee mug. He went over to the coffee pot. He poured his coffee, because this writer is just watching everything John's doing. None of that is bad, but when it's not filled in with the secret weapon of fiction, which is point of view, then you just have characters walking around on a white page. You have no depth. You have nothing interesting. So including that point of view is so important.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author podcast, I talked with Rene Gutteridge about what authors shouldn't learn from movies, including how crucial point of view and inner monologue are in novel writing compared to the visual storytelling required in movies, how writers can mistakenly adopt a director's approach, leading to overly descriptive and less engaging prose, and the science behind the different brain functions of hobbyist writers versus professional writers. We touch on how conciseness in movies contrasts with the depth needed in novels, using examples like Dennis Lehane's Mystic River, and discuss practical strategies for maintaining engaging pacing in fiction without losing substance. And now let's hear from Rene Gutteridge about what authors shouldn't learn from the movies. Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Rene Gutteridge. Hey, Rene, how are you doing?
Hey, how are you? I'm doing great, thank you.
Rene's a returning guest, but just in case you missed her earlier appearance, to give everyone a little bit of background on you, Rene Gutteridge is the multi-genre author of 24 novels plus several nonfiction titles. Her indie film, Skit, won DeadCenter's Best Oklahoma Feature in 2015, and her novel, My Life as a Doormat, was adapted into the Hallmark movie, Love's Complicated. She's the co-writer of the feature film Family Camp, a Movieguide Award winner, and a Dove Award nominee for 2023. She's also a Screencraft finalist in true crime, and Rene is the co-director of WriterCon in Oklahoma City, senior contributor at Writing Momentum, and the head writer at Skit Guys Studios. And last time Rene was on was in episode 253, Navigating the Worlds of Fiction and Film. And so, Rene, I think that the idea of our conversation for this episode came up then. We were just saying every time we talk, we're like, oh, that's another thing we have to have a podcast episode conversation about. But we had talked then a little bit about some of the ways that film and fiction are similar and different, but we didn't. And I think that we probably hit some of the lessons that writers can learn profitably from film. But this time we wanted to talk about what authors shouldn't learn from movies. And I thought it would be fun to start out with circumstances you've seen where people act on lessons they've learned from movies, thinking that's going to translate well into fiction, and the results have not been good. Can you think of any examples like that?
Yes, immediately. Yeah. So I think we're finding more these days, and it's certainly true for me, that I have increased watching things to probably the equal amount to my reading. And I think that's true for a lot of us. We have Netflix now, so we're watching a lot more content than we used to. I remember when I only watched TV when my favorite shows were on, back before cable and everything. So you might watch it here and there. There might be an evening you don't even watch it. And we've got so much content coming in. If I don't watch something every day, I'm so behind. So we're consuming story in a different way now, and still hopefully reading. But I think because watching story takes less brain power than reading story, people are starting to lean towards more watching story. And by people, I'm talking about writers, also public, but writers, when I'll talk to them and see how they're learning, they'll be like, well, I watched this Netflix series, right? And so we have to make sure that our writers are reading novels and obviously nonfiction too. But then we also have to understand you can learn story from both. So the art of story can be learned from film and from fiction. The writing of fiction can't really be learned from film because it is its own art and it's its own craft. And so when you try to watch a movie and then write a novel, it doesn't translate. One of the things to answer your question is I have seen people do what I call directing the character. And that is where the writer of the novel becomes the director of the film in their head. So we all have a mind theater. And as we read, we play this out in our mind, how we, as the reader, interpret what's going on in our mind theater. When we read a novel, all the pieces aren't there, right? That would be very hard to read through.
Yeah.
Right? And we fill in a lot of the gaps in our head. What's happening is now fiction writers are trying to paint the picture, the visual picture that they see in their head onto the paper, which isn't in and of itself a bad thing. But what you find is a writer is watching their character as if they're in a movie, and then writing what they see. So what you get on the page is Joe walked to the cabinet. He opened the door. He grabbed his coffee mug. He went over to the coffee pot. He poured his coffee pot because this writer is just watching everything John's doing. It's like, oh, he's getting coffee. He puts 2 sugars in. He does all that. Okay. None of that is bad, but when it's not filled in with the secret weapon of fiction, which is point of view, then you just have characters walking around on a white page. You have no depth. You have nothing interesting. So including that point of view is so important. And I tell, it just blows people's mind when I say this, but I really believe it. And you'll hear people teach this differently, but I'd go head to head with them in an argument right now about it, because you'll have people tell writers to write it like a movie, write it so that it could be adapted into a movie. But I think that's wrong. And I tell writers, if your chapter can be filmed, you're doing it wrong. So if you could take that chapter and go set up a movie camera and film it as is, you're not nailing it.
That's interesting, that exactly the way you're describing it. When people ask me about like my origin story as a writer, oftentimes my story starts out with, I had the scene playing in my head of a woman who goes to, at the time, an old Victorian house in San Francisco and won't go in. This is Anne Kinnear, the woman who can sense and communicate with the dead. And she doesn't go into the house because the reader knows, but Anne does not, that a murder took place there. And I always describe it as having it play out in my head like a movie. But I realized that the transition I made, which sort of harks forward to a writing approach I took later, is that when I'm framing out my story, almost all the scenes will be like that. You know, Anne goes to the house and doesn't go in because she has a bad feeling about it. And then I'm doing that for all my chapters. And at some point, I'm doing that basically because I don't want to find out that I write a big, long scene of Anne going to a house and having a bad feeling about it, and then later realize it's better if she goes to a bakery and has a bad feeling about it. And now I've written all that stuff about the house, and now I have to rewrite it for the bakery. So that the pass, once I'm done with that whole frame, that pass is to go in and add those things that make it hopefully not any longer like just watching Joe go to the cupboard and take down the mug, and adding in the point of view. And I think that's a distinction between how I'm using framing and then how I'm using, I never know how to describe the other part, writing, creating, that I hadn't thought about before. It's like you're just seeing what's happening versus you're adding the layer of complexity of point of view.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I want to share with you the science behind it. So there's actual science behind this. There was a New York Times article that came back a while ago about a group of scientists. And so they decided to study the writer's brain using MRI. And what they wanted to see is what part of the writer's brain lit up when a writer begins to write. but they had to have two groups, right? And to study the writers group and then this other group. So what they decided to do is take people who consider themselves hobbyist writers or new writers. And so they put them in this MRI machine and they told them to write a passage or scene. And they watched what parts of their brain lit up. And then they took professional novelists and they studied their brain in the same way. Okay, I think this is going to blow your mind. At least it did mine. So the hobbyist writers or the new writers, the part of their brain that lit up was the puzzle solving part of our brain, putting pieces together, right? So figuring out how to solve a puzzle or do a thing or put a doorknob on. That's the part, right? And that makes sense because as we're writing, we're having to put pieces of the whole story together. So when they went over and studied the professional writers, the part of their brain that lit up, can you guess it?
No, I can't.
The part that lit up was the speech part of the brain.
Yeah.
And here's why. Because new writers or hobbyist writers write from a place of looking over their characters and watching what they're doing. Professional writers write from point of view. They're inside their character's head looking out. So they're writing the voice of their character.
Very interesting. That is very interesting. It makes me feel like there's a hook in there somewhere of whatever the word is I'm searching for when I'm trying to describe to people the difference between what I'm doing when I'm framing out the story and what I'm doing when I'm doing all that other stuff.
Yeah, when you sink down into the passage of the story, it's the difference if we're taking John and we're looking at his cabinet and his mug. Okay, the hobbyist brain is going, okay, he's opening the cabinet. He's got to pull out the mug. He's going to get the coffee. Okay, but if we're a reader, do we care at all about this? I do not. That's the life I live every day. I don't. I'm skimming over this and I'm not getting attached to John. From the professional novelist's brain, John goes to the cabinet and opens it. He starts to reach for the red mug, then reaches for the blue. Why? Why doesn't he pick the red mug? He doesn't want the red mug. Why? Yeah. Already you're provoking interest. And in his mind, he's playing out through a point of view perspective why he hates that red mug. And that gives us a sense of this story because it was Peggy's and he hates Peggy and he'll never drink from a mug that Peggy drank from for the rest of his life. She also loved red. So, and now you've got a whole story about John and Peggy that started from opening a cabinet door. Because what the reader cares about and what we should care about is not what John is seeing. We have to know what he's seeing, but what he's seeing, we want to know the whys behind it. Why does he see an ordinary mug like this? I don't think twice about the mug that I drink from every morning until my mug's not there. I have two of them. I bought two of the same mug because I love them so much. When neither of these mugs are there, now I've got an issue. In fact, for those watching, I'm drinking from this mug this morning and it's irritating me.
Oh, really? That's not the magic mug?
Oh, no. This is too heavy and it's too big. It covers my whole face and I don't like it. But somebody didn't do the dishes last night, so I don't have either of my mugs and it's my own fault. And that sinks us into greater truths and interesting facts about a character. What does that tell you about me that I highly dislike drinking from any other mug but the two mugs that are identical that I bought because I love them so much? I mean, you could go many ways with that, right?
Yeah. Well, I can imagine that someone who's early, even maybe later in their writing career, and is hearing that story about the experiment that showed the parts of the brain related to speech lighting up for the experienced writers. I can imagine someone saying, oh, well, then the trick is going to be to write from deep first-person point of view. And that the Joe story would be, I trudged across the kitchen, opened the cupboard door, and was dismayed to see that the only mug available to me was the red mug that I'm not ever going to drink from because that belonged to Peggy. And that might, polished up, translate perfectly well into a novel presentation. Is there, in the spectrum of just showing what people are seeing to what they're thinking, what they're saying to themselves in their head, the translation is easier if somebody's writing in a deep first-person point of view. But if someone is writing in somewhere in between those two extremes, what would be your advice for how they can act on that advice about professional writing is more like speech and less like seeing?
So I'm going to blow everybody's mind again, hopefully. Maybe everybody's like, we already know this. No, but here's the deal. You can go as deep in third person as you can in first person. If you take a first person thought train, inner monologue, I went to the cabinet, I opened it, I spotted Peggy's mug. I hate Peggy, and off we go with the story. There's no reason why you can't do that in third person. John went to the cabinet, he opened it. There was Peggy's mug. He hated Peggy. And he hated that she loved red. He once loved red, and now he doesn't. We, in modern storytelling, you're starting to see a move away from italicized thoughts, and you're seeing it more integrated just into the story, where you're not actually leaving the moment to italicize a thought as it is. So if John were to go to the cabinet, look at the red mug, and then go, I really hate Peggy. I hate that she loves red. You would put that in its own line, italicize it, because that's his exact thought. But if you keep it in the narrative, in the inner monologue, John hated Peggy. This is the narrator, deep in the point of view. John hated Peggy, and he hated that she loved red. And da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Then you've got a deep point of view from a third person perspective that's just as deep as first person. There's no reason why you can't do it. And the great thing about third person is then you can go to somebody else's point of view in the next chapter and get into their point of view. And that's a totally different character with a totally different voice, with a totally different perspective. And that's always really fun, right? To these two characters who see one thing completely differently. She loves red bugs. We meet Peggy. What's wrong with Peggy, right? Or whatever. And you get to see her perspective. That makes for really fun storytelling. And I've written in first person. I've written a couple of books in first person, and I enjoyed it. But I sure love writing in third person deep more than first person, because it just gives me a lot more options to dive into characters.
Yeah, this is a well-timed conversation because I'm working on the 6th Lizzie Ballard book, and then I'm going to be, I believe, spinning up a separate series based on one of the other characters in those books. And I'm really debating. I've never written anything in first person, and I'm going to write a short story first to see how it goes, to experiment with point of view, because I think that the first person would be tricky because this character is very quiet and very sort of interior anyway. Well, maybe it's just a matter that I have more experience with third person, so I'm leaning toward that because I just know it better.
Yeah, and first person, that character has to be so interesting that they can hold a whole book. And yet, what you can't do is do this whole long 300-page inner monologue, and which happens sometimes in first person. People get into first person, they just keep writing in the head. And it's like when you go to coffee with somebody and it's a 45-minute coffee and they've talked the whole time and you're just trying so hard to pay attention, but they're just chasing rabbits and doing all kinds of things. And so I found it to be the hardest of all the points of view. Well, I only work in 2, third and first, but I found it hard myself. But I did enjoy it. I really think I developed some very interesting characters when I wrote in first person. But I still would probably choose third unless there was a good reason to do first. So,
well, I do realize that for my other books, over time, they have become more sort of cast. I have secondary characters, but they're very important secondary characters. And even though the series has a particular character's name, one of the things I really enjoy is putting together the cast of characters in different combinations. There might be two characters that you never expect to have be in a situation of being stranded alone on a deserted road in a car that isn't running. But now we have an opportunity to see what that's like. Oh, and here's a character that started dating this other character. We never saw that coming. What is that like? So I can see that I don't think this new series would be quite the cast of characters that, for example, Lucy Ballard books are, but it would make it much harder to. I mean, I suppose you can go from one first-person point of view to another first-person point of view, but I find that very jarring when I read those kinds of books.
I have done that, and it made sense in the moment. The editors agreed. Everybody agreed. Yeah, let's do this. And then I wrote the whole book that way, and we all read it, and we were like, this is not working. And I had to rewrite the whole book. And I mean, just almost start over in a sense, because it got confusing. There were too many characters, and the plot was too complicated to try to do it through multiple first person points of view. So there was and you have those sometimes and you learn, but I have seen it, and I have seen it work. So it's not impossible, but it usually, I think, works better if these characters sort of have their own storyline throughout that all kind of merge together towards the midpoint or the end. And then we have to sort of experience it very slowly through each character. But that's really only my opinion. I don't have enough expertise doing it to even tell somebody how. All I know is I did it poorly. So,
well, I remember interviewing Ben Winters, who wrote the Last Policeman series. So we were talking about The Last Policeman, and he said he had written that whole thing, I think, in first person, past tense. And then he realized he was all done, and he realized that if you're writing a story about a meteor approaching Earth, and soon it's going to hit Earth, and everyone's going to die, then writing it in past tense kind of doesn't make sense. And he had to go through it and change it all to present tense. I may be getting the details of that story wrong, but that was the general thing. He had written it all, and he was like, oh, there's a logic problem with the point of view that I've chosen, because we don't necessarily want to telegraph that there might be the possibility of a past tense in the future, if that makes sense.
That's funny. Oh, that's a great story problem that you wouldn't even figure out till the end.
No.
But yeah,
No.
that is great. That's funny. I have written in present tense, first person present tense, and that was fun, but even more challenging present tense because it's moment to moment.
Yeah.
And
I don't think I'd even try that one.
Yeah, it was hard, but it worked for both let's see, I think I did it once. It worked really well for that because we were experiencing it as she was experiencing it, and that was a really important part of the storyline.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, we've been talking a lot about how the point of view that fiction writers can bring is very different than the point of view of a viewer of a movie. But I want to hit maybe a couple of other ways in which authors shouldn't learn from movies. I think shouldn't learn from movies, but maybe this is not the case. And I'm thinking of a conversation I had in a recent episode with Doug Bigliotti, and we got talking about Mystic River, Dennis Lehane's Mystic River. So one of the things he was pointing out is that Clint Eastwood achieves in 2 minutes in Mystic River what it takes Dennis Lehane 40 pages to establish in the book. And he wasn't saying that as a pro or a con for either one. He liked both of them very much, but he was just using it as an illustration of how economical you can / have to be in movies.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that a possible learning is, conciseness, brevity is good. We all have short attention spans, so I'm going to boil this down as much as possible. So is that pull toward boiling down a positive message that we can get from movies or a negative message we can get from movies? Or maybe, it depends.
Well, I would say the reason why not a novel in this example, in Mystic River, there's 40 pages for 1 minute or 3 minutes or whatever he said, is point of view. We do not have that in movies. And so all of the inner parts of the story that make novels so lovable, that is the thing. When you go see the movie based on the novel, you always say, well, the novel was better because there's this huge amount of stuff missing that most readers can't identify what it is, right? They're just in this for entertainment. They love to read. They're not picking it apart like writers are when we're reading it. But they just go, well, I just didn't. I loved Katniss more in the book, let's say, for Hunger Games. So the reason, that's why I say, if you can film it page for page, you're doing it wrong. Because screenwriters have to take 40 pages. Certainly budget is a huge, when we film 3 pages, we film 3 pages of script maybe on a good day in one day. If we had all the time in the world and $50 million, we'd film a half a page in a day. But the thing that is bulking up or should be bulking up your pages is that inner monologue. And if you can film your chapter and put it directly on this page of the script, then you could immediately sense what's missing, which is your point of view. That's what bulks up a story. We don't have that in movies. And so what screenwriters have to do is we have to look at this 40 pages and we have to go, okay, what's the point and what do we need the audience to know about this character? Well, in 40 pages, you've developed backstory in there. There's been reflection. There's been how he sees the world, why he sees the world the way he does, that kind of thing in 40 pages. And we have 3 minutes to do that. That's rough. That's very hard to do. And it takes often a great actor to really take 1 or 2 lines of dialogue and just pull all that beauty out that we've written in the book. So that to me is the difference. And, when you're reading a book, and of course our modern minds are just shrinking in a sense where it's like our minds are bulking up with information, but shrinking with the ability to pay attention for a long time, right? And so many of us don't have the patience to sit through that 40 pages. And so this is where you're starting to see these novels that aren't bulked up, that read with a clip. They're fast. But as I think I told you in the other podcast, I would argue that you probably don't remember that character the next day. You've not been able to attach to the character. And as writers, I think that's really important to us. When we go see a movie, we often walk away and maybe we're talking about the next day and we'll say this, well, when Brad Pitt did that, right? Yeah. Or George Clooney did that. I just saw Wolves. That was a fantastic movie, and we're naming the actor. I don't think anybody can name the character unless it's just in a really, really good movie where we got so immersed into it that we forgot who's playing, and that Brad Pitt is Joe. And Brad Pitt will always be Joe in our minds, that kind of thing. And that's a really well done movie. But that's what we want in reading. We want our characters to step off the page, go to bed with our reader, get up the next morning and have coffee with him. And that reader is still thinking about that character because we want him to go to the office with us. And then we want our reader to talk about that book at the water cooler. Yeah, that sells our next book. So I know there is a lot of this. I don't even know what it's called, pop fiction or dime fiction. I don't know. It's just, they're 99 cents. You can read them in your lunch break. And that's out there. And it's legitimate. I'm not knocking it at all. It's just, if you're trying to write the great American novel, then you've got to have more of the substance in there.
Yeah, it's sort of like the fast food of reading material. If all you want is just, I have 2 hours and I just want to have a little escapism, as opposed to I want to sit down to a well-prepared meal.
Exactly. Well put.
And I think that I'm going to illustrate exactly what you just said, because now I'm obsessing about Mystic River, and I watched the movie after I had that conversation with Doug, realizing that I had watched it once before and had forgotten that I had watched it. That's probably not good. And I think I was equally irritated for 2 reasons about Mystic River, which I think is getting to the point you're making. One is that the Kevin Bacon character, the one who has the wife who keeps calling him but not saying anything, I found that so incredibly irritating because there was no backstory. There would just be periodically scenes where Kevin Bacon picks up his phone and you see the screen is filled with a woman from like the nose down, so all you can see is her mouth not saying anything. And he would obviously find that upsetting, but then he would hang up the phone, or she would hang up the phone, and they would go on. And then at the end, she finally says something. And I was so not invested in that. I was just, first of all, irritated. I'm like, do you really want to get together with this woman who just calls you up and then like breathes on the phone to you? Like, that's kind of sick. And there didn't seem to be any, I mean, I believe Kevin Bacon is a good actor, but there was no sort of illustration in its behavior because we weren't getting point of view of how traumatic this must have been for him. And then the other thing that annoyed me about Mystic River is at the end. So I'm trying to say this without it being a spoiler in case somebody hasn't watched it. But 2 of the 3 major characters are watching a parade, and they're kind of like across the street from each other. And one of them like does the sort of pulling the trigger with your finger thing to the other character. I was like, what's the In fact, I got done. I chat GPT'd. What's the deal with this one character like doing the trigger finger at the other character? And they said, there are many interpretations of this. And I was like, I kind of don't want there to be many interpretations of that. I kind of want to understand because that is clearly indicating what the entire rest of the relationship of those 2 characters is going to be for the rest of their lives. And I thought, that's got to be clearer in the book. Now I have to go watch it, because with more interiority, there wouldn't be that what's the word I want? Lack of clarity
Confusion.
About about what that means.
Yeah. And that is again the challenge of the filmmaker. There are many screenwriters writing excellent movies that are not based on books. But it's a financial decision because a book has done well and people have loved it. So let's make a movie of it. And so there's many great screenplays out there that should be made that are being replaced with a movie adaptation. But yeah, I mean, again, the challenge of the director and the screenwriter to take 90,000 words and figure out how to tell it completely visually. And it goes to show a well-written book when that's super hard. And that's why I think I always refer to The Hunger Games. Billy Ray was the screenwriter on that. He's one of my favorite screenwriters, and I've studied tons of his work because he really does do it well. But a well-written book is very hard to adapt for that reason, because there is substance over here that you can use to inform your visuals, but you can't use it in the way that it was written. So you have to create a new way to tell what's in here that you can't film. There's whole parts of this book you cannot film, you cannot see. It's backstory, it's inner monologue. How do you get that over to a movie? And so a lot of people have missed the mark over the years. They're like, hey, what if we do like this gun? The creatives get in this room and they're like, a gun. Everybody will totally get that, right?
Or at least they'll be talking about it a lot.
Yeah. And some filmmakers, I mean, when they acquired the rights of the book, depending on the contract, they really can do whatever they want. They can take a story and just demolish it. And we've seen, it was a male in one book and then it's a female in the movie adaptation. So they're acquiring that intellectual property to do with it what they want. And some directors and writers are very sensitive to the original project, or that writer is a producer on the film, so they get creative input. or they're not. And they just are like, this is a great premise. We're going to take it and do something else with it. And so you see that, and that it's just the way that it works. But that is the challenge. So I would say you can make it. There are ways, and maybe this is another podcast, Matty, but there are ways to make a novel clip along fast without compromising point of view and some of the substantive things that we have in there. And I don't think you have to take that out to make a novel move fast and be a page turner. There are techniques in fiction writing that make a page turner, just like there are techniques in filmmaking that make a fast moving, flowing movie. So, but we don't want to adopt those from film into novels if it takes away from the substance of a novel.
Well, I do think I have a whole bunch of notes here that would constitute at least 2 more podcast episodes today. So I don't want to, if we dive into it, we're going to go way past our time limit. But one of the things I was thinking, sort of sticking with the point of view and interiority aspect, is I'm thinking that if somebody's really having trouble getting past that, Joe walked into the kitchen and opened the cupboard and took out the blue mug, it might be fun to think about those older movies that have the voiceover. I came into the kitchen thinking it sure seemed lonely without Peggy there. And not that you, like, obviously, if you did that literally, that would be bad in a different way. But I wonder if that would be kind of a stepping stone to getting out of that mindset of I'm just describing what I'm seeing on the screen.
That's a great idea, because when we talk about new novelists often have this question. I don't understand my voice. What's my voice? You hear that a lot, right? Like, I understand my writer's voice. Okay, well, in fiction and nonfiction, that's a separate question. In fiction, your voice is the voice of your character, and you're narrating it. You're creating the narrative voice. So in film, when you have a voiceover, that's the narrator, right? The narrator, he's guiding you through the story and telling you inner thoughts. So if you can adapt that into the inner monologue, and in the inner monologue, we have to keep in mind 2 very specific and important things. It has to be interesting and entertaining. So, like I said, you don't want to just go start on all of these thoughts of a character. They have to be intentional to the story. Why does the color of the mug matter to the story and to the character? If it matters, put it in there. But yeah, then you've created the narrator. The character is the narrator of the story. The character is taking us through. Your character, Joe, we're going to live the next 300 pages through Joe's eyes. He becomes the voice of the novel. And that's why it's so important, that New York Times article, instead of over here putting puzzle pieces together, that does need to function. But alongside of that, which is creating the plot over here on that side of the brain, the speech part of the brain is lighting up. And that is where we interpret every place that we're in through Joe's eyes. So I think I've used the example maybe here before. A chef doesn't see green. A chef sees the color of kale. The chef sees the world through food. Everything is interpreted through food. And you look at your character, what they do for a living, what their past is, are they male or female, their age, and you put that lens on your eyeballs and you write the character that way. How I see the world is very different than how a 14-year-old sees the world. So you have to put the correct lens on, and multiple lenses. It's like they're female, they're 56, they've had 3 marriages, they've got cancer, and they're going on the vacation of their dreams. All those lenses go on, and you write through that point of view.
And you can decide even if you're a coffee snob, you can decide whether once Joe picks out his mug, he puts some instant coffee in there and puts in hot water from the tap versus getting out his fancy espresso machine.
Matty, that's so important. That right there is a perfect example of building a character with pieces visually from the world that mean something internally. In my mind, what kind of person uses instant coffee? I can't even imagine. I don't even understand that person. And my father used instant coffee his whole life, and I would just cringe. I just watch him with the little granules and the barely hot water. He's stirring together. The granules are floating to the top. And I just couldn't understand it. And I would take him to Starbucks. I'd like to have taste the difference. Your coffee and this coffee. And he's like, oh, no, this is good. And then he'd just go back to his granulated coffee. And that's a perfect example of if you're going to make that choice to show us what kind of coffee he's drinking, then it needs to be intentional. You're using it as the device to tell us something about John or Joe. I can't remember our character's name now in the
ordinary Joe.
Yeah, it's got to be intentional. Everything that you do, and this is high level writing, everything that's on that page means something. The color of the wallpaper. And if your character notices the wallpaper, there has to be a reason. Either their personality or for the plot, there's got to be a reason. You don't put anything on the page that isn't building to the next part of the story or informing us about the character. And if you can write tight like that, you're going to have one of those stories that people can't put down.
Well, Rene, I always love talking to you, and I think this is one of these episodes where people will be taking you to work with them and thinking about it when they go to the water cooler and all those good things that you mentioned earlier you want people to do with your books as well. So thank you so much for another lovely conversation. I have all my notes here about follow-up discussion about what we can and can't learn from movies. So please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
All right. Well, thank you. Yes, it's renegutteridge.com is the best place to find me, and it has all my information.
Great. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Rene. Can you help me think of a word to use for the process that happens after I've completed the frame of my story that I mentioned in our conversation in the interview? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube. Also, if you were intrigued by Rene's comments about author voice toward the end of our conversation, stay tuned for an upcoming episode with Tiffany Yates Martin on that very topic. And if you got value from the episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.